discussed how the study and practice of rhetoric started in the classical, medieval, and Renaissance periods. We learned the usefulness of rhetoric in these periods and how it flourished in different contexts of public discourse, knowledge, production, and distribution of information. Now, we're going to move to modern and contemporary rhetoric. This time, there is an abundance of information, knowledge, and rhetorical artifacts due to advancements of technology. We first knew rhetoric as a study of spoken discourse. Now, we will include written and visual discourse in this lecture. We also saw rhetoric as a way to analyze public affairs. Now, we will include the significance of rhetoric as part of private life. The classical, medieval, and Renaissance periods focused on the invention of arguments and how to deliver them effectively and aesthetically. But in the contemporary period, we will notice that there will be a shift from rhetoric as guiding the production of discourse to rhetoric as enhancing the consumption of discourse. In this lecture, we will explore 6 schemas of persuasion from 7 scholars. The first thing that we will discuss is Cain Perelman and Madame Lucy Albrecht-Titica's The New Rhetoric. Perelman and Albrecht-Titica argue that no claim or conclusion is self-evidently true. Only a sustained process of public argumentation could propositions of value and policy be tested and established as sufficiently reasonable or rejected as lacking rational merit. This means that the value of a claim or information can be tested through public discourse. Ideas can and must be tested publicly, and knowledge is considered knowledge when there is a community of agreement. Thus, Perelman and Albrecht-Titica focused on the concepts of audience and argumentation. According to these scholars, there are 3 types of audience: the universal audience, the audience of the single hearer, and the audience of the self. The universal audience consists of all rational people. The highest point of assurance that an argument is reasonable is reached when there is an agreement of the universal audience. Thus, reasons addressed to this audience are to be compelling, self-evident, and timeless, thus independent of local concerns. The speaker's character is reflected in the conception they form of the universal audience. The second audience, who is the audience of the single hearer, is the one whom the speaker addresses in a dialogue. The role of this audience is to act as the speaker's opponent by advancing counter-arguments. In other words, they provide a check on each step in the reasoning process by raising objections, asking for clarifications, and providing their own counter-arguments. It may look like a debate contest, but the goal is not to win the debate, but to engage in dialogue leading to a reasonable decision. If our arguments succeed before an audience of a single, careful critic, they may be ready for the test of the universal audience. The third audience is the audience of self. This is the speaker itself, and the process of presenting arguments to oneself is called self-deliberation. Self-deliberation is crucial to the process of inventing or coming up with arguments. Self-deliberation is viewed as a kind of argumentation and not as a distinct cognitive activity. We employ the same arguments to persuade others that we use to persuade ourselves. The secrecy of a personal, internal debate is seen as a guarantee of its sincerity, as we are not interested in deceiving ourselves. Before we test our arguments and ideas for public discourse, we start first with ourselves, then to a single critic, and eventually to all rational people involved. Ideas are developed and strengthened as it moves forward from one type of audience to another through argumentation. But what is the process of argumentation? There should be starting points of argument. These are points of agreement between a rhetor and an audience that allow for argumentation to develop. Perelman and Albrecht-Titica identified these starting points as the real or facts, truths, and presumptions, and the preferable or values, hierarchies, and lines of argument relating to the preferable. When these starting points are established, it is also important to establish a presence. We need to make certain facts present to an audience. Establishing presence involves the choice to emphasize certain ideas and facts over others, thus encouraging an audience to attend to them. If establishing starting points are more rational, establishing presence of an idea is more of a sensory experience. Presence is reflected on the style or delivery of speech or writing. The next scholar that we will explore is Jürgen Habermas and the conditions of rational discourse. Habermas believes that there is an ideal speech community and a rational society, and this belief leads him to a communication theory that seeks to liberate the self. Habermas's rational society is built on the foundation of rationally liberated individuals speaking to one another as equals. To Habermas's way of thinking, establishing a rational society requires both the correct interpretation and the subsequent transformation of the present society. In order to achieve rationality, argumentative dialogue is needed. Dialogue affords the opportunity to test propositions and their underlying values. Dialogue, of course, is guided by universal pragmatics, communicative competence, and rational communicative transactions. Universal pragmatics sets out the rules for using and understanding language rationally. The goal of universal pragmatics is open, equitable, ethical, and thus rational discourse aimed at freeing human beings from dominance. Such discourse takes place in what Habermas called the public sphere, a place of discussion among individuals unrestrained by the dominating influence of political systems and the interests of the state. We will discuss more about public sphere on my next lecture video. Communicative competence is the conditions under which rational communication is possible. In order to have communicative competence, a truth claim is shared by the speaker and hearer. The hearer is led to understand and accept the speaker's intention, and the speaker adapts to the hearer's worldview. Finally, rational communicative transactions means that everyone should communicate on an equal footing. In order for communicative transactions to be rational, they must meet three conditions. These include first, that the discussion be unrestrained, which means that all participants are allowed to speak freely and to present their positions without fear of being restricted. Second, all advocates must have a right to self-representation, and that is the freedom to speak for themselves. And third, a full complement of norms and expectations must be in place under the conditions of rational discourse. Habermas's critical theory on rational discourse helps us analyze how people talk and think, and how discourse should lead to a new and liberating consciousness. For Habermas, false ideologies leads to false thinking, which in turn leads to false consciousness, flawed, and thus distorting view of reality, or the world, and of people. The next scholar we will explore is Kenneth Burke and his dramatistic PENTAD. Burke sees rhetoric as symbol inducement, in which rhetoric is the use of symbols to shape and change human beings and their context. Symbols not only signifies our existence and our understanding of ourselves and the world, symbols are also the means of change and transformation. In order to realize this definition of rhetoric, Burke used the language of drama as a means to analyze rhetorical artifacts and understand why people choose the actions they do. He conceptualized 5 elements for rhetorical analysis: act, scene, agent, agency, and purpose. The act is what was done or is being done. The scene is the location of the act or its setting. The agent is the person performing the action, while the agency is the means by which the agent performs the act. Finally, the purpose is the reason for the action or the intended goal. When using the PENTAD for analysis, it is better to combine the elements as ratios than to separately identify the elements. Burke's PENTAD focuses mainly to understand human motivations when producing a rhetorical artifact. But we can also use the PENTAD to analyze strategic persuasion by looking at the ratio of elements. The next scholar we will explore is Lloyd Bitzer and his concept of rhetorical situation. A rhetorical situation is any circumstance in which one or more people employ rhetoric, finding all the available means of persuasion. Speakers and writers who use rhetoric are called rhetors. A rhetorical situation is defined by three elements: an exigence, an audience, and constraints. All rhetorical situations originate with an exigence. The exigence is what motivates a rhetor to argue in the first place. Why does the rhetor need to make this point? What will this argument do for the world? Bitzer sees exigence as an imperfect situation or something that is waiting to be done. The audience, according to Bitzer, consists of only of those persons who are capable of being influenced by discourse and of being mediators of change. You are not a member of a rhetorical audience merely because you heard a rhetorical appeal. There are two kinds of audience: the immediate and mediated audience. The immediate audience are the individuals literally listening to or reading the rhetor's argument, while the mediated audience are the individuals for whom the argument is intended. The last element of a rhetorical situation is the constraint. Constraints are made up of persons, events, objects, and relations which are part of the situation because they have the power to constrain decision and action needed to modify the exigence. Constraints may be thought of as the boundaries within which rhetoric is both created and advanced. Common constraints include the knowledge of the rhetor and audience about the subject matter, beliefs held by the rhetor and audience about the subject matter, the culture of the rhetor and audience, the time, place, and timing of the argument, and relationship between the rhetor and the audience. When we examine the rhetorical situation, we need to identify these three elements. It is also important to know the rhetorical situation because it actually dictates or prescribes the response appropriate to it. The next scholar we will explore is Michel Foucault's Discourse, Knowledge, and Power. Foucault is concerned with how power plays in the use of language and rhetoric. Foucault understands power as something that is not the result of conscious or intentional decision, but rather of a complex and almost indecipherable set of language practices within a culture. Thus, power installs itself and produces real material effects. We need to take note that power in Foucault's point of view is fluid. It is not imposed through social structures and hierarchies, but rather it flows from discourse. These systems of discourse come to control how we think and what we claim to know. We are constrained by the power generated by systems of discourse. What then is a discourse? Discourse for Foucault is a process of producing knowledge. We define knowledge as a matter of the social, historical, and political conditions under which statements come to count as true or false. To validate knowledge, we need to bring these claims and ideas to the public. Foucault then was interested in the discursive practices within a culture that provided the framework for knowledge, meaning, and power. Knowledge is a product of what can be discussed and how topics may be discussed. As such, knowledge is constantly being reconfigured as the rules governing discourse change over time. In other words, the production of discourse is at once controlled, selected, organized, and redistributed according to a certain number of procedures, whose role is to avert its powers and its dangers in every society. When we analyze a rhetorical artifact, we need to identify who produced it and what is their relation to society. We also need to look at how the artifact was produced. What are the rules and procedures of the society that shape the production of the artifact? Then we look at the knowledge produced by the artifact by looking at the power relations between the artifact and the audience. How does the artifact control and shape the knowledge and discourse of the audience? We can also look at how the audience free themselves from the constraining effects of knowledge and power. Foucault offered a solution from these constraining effects, to escape from himself, to become other than he was. Thus, we can look at how the audience transformed themselves in order to resist the power imposed to them. These are some of the things that we can look at when analyzing rhetorical artifacts in terms of power. Foucault's view of power and language could be applied fruitfully to the analysis of political practices, religious discourse, and the use of mass media to shape opinion. Foucault provides a wide range of possibilities to those interested in the uses of discourse in shaping culture and distributing power. The last scholar that we will discuss in this lecture is Jacques Derrida and his concept of deconstruction. Derrida believes that language cannot escape the built-in biases of the cultural history that produced it. Thus, we need Derrida's deconstruction in analyzing rhetorical artifacts to reveal the hidden mechanisms subtly at work influencing meaning, to demonstrate the concealed power of symbols to shape thinking, and to underline the fact that no one escaped these elusive qualities of language. If rhetoric teaches us the power of intentional structuring of text, Derrida and deconstruction teach us that no author is in complete, intentional, conscious control of the meanings of any written text. What he is trying to say is that even if we are intentional in producing rhetorical artifacts, we may not be conscious on the meaning that can be extracted from what we produce because of the embedded context or culture. We need to take note that meanings are not fixed, and that constructing meanings involves an ongoing process of social negotiation. So, how does deconstruction work? Deconstruction is a process that challenges traditional assumptions concerning language and meaning. It involves dissecting the underlying structures of meaning and implication. In rhetoric, deconstruction is used to reveal the blind spots of argument that result from rigid, unexamined meanings attributed to terms. When we analyze a rhetorical artifact using deconstruction, we look at the intended meaning of the artifact and uncover other meanings that corresponds to the cultural, socioeconomic, and political context of the artifact. We can uncover these meanings by looking at the effects of rhetorical interactions. The theories, concepts, and schemas of persuasion in the modern and contemporary period show that rhetoric is more than just formulating and delivering arguments. Rhetoric also involves knowledge production and validation, meanings, human motivation and response, cultural, socioeconomic, and political context, and power. If classical, medieval, and Renaissance periods help us understand how a particular rhetorical artifact is effective based on its structure, the modern and contemporary period adds more layers to our analysis as it helps us understand a rhetorical artifact based on its motivation, meaning, and effect.